Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving right into a seriously fascinating psychological shift. Have you ever known a guy who just seemingly got stronger only after life completely broke him? You know the exact type. He doesn't really talk much about what he's been through, mostly because he just doesn't need to. But something about the way he carries himself, the way he waits a beat before he speaks, it tells you he's navigated some really rough terrain that most people try to avoid. He's sharper, he's calmer, and man, he is remarkably harder to rattle than guys half his age. So today, we're unpacking the psychology of men who find their greatest, most unshakable strength later in life. To really get this, we have to start with a specific feeling. Just picture a smart guy in his 30s. He's sitting in some Monday morning meeting, his coffee's getting cold, and he's just kind of half listening to someone drone on and on about Q3 targets. On paper, he looks successful, right? But underneath it all, there's this low-grade wrongness. He feels it right in his bones. It's exactly like the quote you're seeing. Like wearing shoes one size too small. I mean, you can walk in them, you can even run in them if you really have to, but your feet, they always know. He sees exactly what's wrong, but he just can't explain why he keeps staying in a life that simply doesn't fit. Now, society usually gets this completely backwards. The big myth is that this older, unshakable man just got dealt a better hand, better genetics, way less stress, a perfectly stable career from day one, but their gritty reality is wildly different. The men who become genuinely stronger later on, they almost always went through more, not less. The data from our sources highlights this so perfectly. Like, one guy moved into a camper van at 52, just him and the open road. Everyone around him thought he was totally falling apart, but actually, he felt like himself for the very first time. Another man got sober in 2008, lost pretty much everything, and then had to rebuild from scratch. So it wasn't some easy, breezy life that built these guys. It was the absolute dismantling of it. So let's dive into part one. The unseen foundation. We're going to look at why that so-called wasted time is actually the groundwork.
Which brings us to part two, wearing the wrong mask, the real burden of that quiet misery in your 30s and 40s.
So the legendary psychologist Carl Jung had this idea. He said the first half of life is basically just spent learning to fit in. You wear this mask that the world hands you, and you just try to make it work. All those years of instability, of wandering around and feeling like you were just wasting time, those were actually the raw materials of you trying to force on a mask that wasn't yours. Now, most guys who pull off the act get heavily rewarded by society, but some men, they never quite manage it. And here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. It's not because they're broken, it's because the mask was just never meant for them in the first place. Every single time they try to force it, something deep down screams no. And that internal resistance, that inability to conform, is actually a built-in protective mechanism. It keeps them from getting permanently stuck in a totally false life. Imagine this for a second. You're 38 years old. It's 6:45 p.m. You're driving home from work. Your phone's sitting there with 23 unread messages. And you've already agreed to 3 different things this week that you desperately did not want to do simply because saying no felt, well, too complicated. You've become the guy everyone leans on. Because somewhere deep down, this guy believes that being useful is the exact same thing as being loved. Just listen to this confession we found. My biggest mistake has been my kindness. I have been taken advantage of for years by many. I want you to really let that sink in. This isn't about being taken advantage of by some random strangers. It's by the people who count on him never, ever saying no. When you genuinely believe your value comes entirely from what you do for other people, setting a boundary doesn't feel healthy. It literally feels like a massive betrayal. And man, you pay a heavy, heavy toll for carrying that belief. All right, moving on to part 3, the breaking point. This is when the body finally starts to notice. You can spend years, literally decades, being who you're supposed to be instead of who you actually are. But eventually, you just can't outrun it. This hidden pressure, it starts showing up in undeniable ways. You get this fatigue that simply won't lift, no matter what you try. Sleep doesn't even help. You get these weird attention deficits you can't explain but just can't shake. Every ambition, buried, so nobody calls you arrogant. Every bit of anger, swallowed, just to keep the peace. But the source material reminds us of a fundamental psychological law here. That energy didn't just disappear. No way. It just went underground. What looks like a guy standing perfectly still is actually a man under immense, terrifying pressure, and it's building without him even realizing it. I really want to pause here for a second and just ask, is this exactly where you are right now? Maybe you're past 40, or maybe past 50, and you're watching this explainer thinking, okay, sure, but nothing has changed for me. I'm still tired, I'm still stuck, and I'm still waiting on a turn that never seems to come. Well, I want you to really hear me on this. That stuck feeling, that numbness you can't quite explain, it is not proof that you are too late. And it is definitely not the end of your story. When you map out this whole psychological journey, a really distinct timeline starts to emerge. In your 30s, it's that quiet misery we talked about, the shoes that just don't fit. Then, by your 40s, the pressure absolutely peaks. This is the breaking point, where your body and mind basically start failing under the sheer weight of that mask. But look at what happens next. In the 50s, we see the shift. So that current fatigue and stuckness you might be feeling, that is literally just the immense pressure building right before things finally move. You absolutely haven't missed your shot. You are just in the middle of the journey, the part that nobody ever warns you about.
That brings us to part 4, the dark night. Let's look at the actual mechanics of this shift.
Fair warning, this transition, it is not a gentle process. The turnaround rarely arrives the way you'd expect it to. It almost always kicks off with some kind of trigger. Sometimes it's sitting in an exam room in one of those awful paper gowns, having your first checkup in 4 years, and realizing you've been treating your own body like it's somebody else's problem. Or maybe it's watching your daughter's first dance at her wedding and suddenly feeling the weight of everything you put on hold. And then comes what we call the terrible year. This is the year that almost breaks you. Getting out of bed actually requires a reason. And let's be real, some mornings, that reason is incredibly thin. But to reach the turn, you have to sit with that pain. You can't just keep staying busy and trying to avoid it anymore.
Carl Jung actually called this agonizing middle phase the dark night before the turn. It defines the exact moment where the old version of you has completely stopped working, but the new version, it hasn't shown up yet. You are just sort of suspended in the middle. Naturally, most people run from this. They numb it, they distract themselves with whatever they can find, but the man who stays in it, the guy who doesn't run from the darkness, he comes out the other side permanently and completely changed.
And finally, part 5, strength without performance, emerging on the other side. So what actually happens when that overwhelming need to perform just completely vanishes? Well, think about the motivations of your average 28-year-old at the gym. He's usually there because he thinks he's supposed to be, right? Driven by dating, societal expectations, or maybe this quiet, creeping fear of turning into his dad. But post-shift, let's say at age 54, he's back at the squat rack for a completely different reason. Zero performance. He's driven purely by a genuine curiosity about what his body can still do. It's this raw internal interest, and it is entirely detached from needing anyone else's approval. We see that exact same liberation in his daily priorities, too. Back at 28, life was just a desperate scramble for agreement. It was all about needing the people around him to sign off on his choices just so he felt validated. But post-shift, the older man values honest boundaries. He says no, and he does it without offering some long, drawn-out explanation. And honestly, he's genuinely surprised by how little the world actually ends when he finally starts putting himself first. He just chooses raw honesty over needing everyone to agree with him all the time. This post-shift man is really defined by quiet, powerful victories. He's the guy who just randomly picks up the phone and calls an old college buddy for 2 hours, totally unscripted, not scheduled 3 weeks in advance. He says, I'm not going to do that freely and easily. The younger guys around him, they just see someone who's doing well. They don't see the grit it took to get there. They don't see that he's survived getting fired and realized it doesn't actually kill you. They have no idea he had his heart utterly broken at 41, started over from absolute zero, and rebuilt his life from the ashes. He knows what actually matters now, simply because he's already survived his worst days. And all of this profound internal shifting, it leads to tangible, real-world results. Take the number 47, for example. Our sources highlighted this incredible specific anecdote of a late bloomer, a guy who really went through the grinder. Every single one of his wins, his career, his money, his ultimate self-respect, they all came super late in the game. But because his foundation was built on surviving his own personal dark night, what he built was completely unshakable, to the point where he actually managed to retire at 47. He had this incredible realization. He said, "Every win came late, but when it came, I went further than I ever expected." That brutal foundation of hardship, it didn't hold him back. Those years of quiet misery were absolutely not a waste. They were actually the slingshot that propelled him further and way higher than he ever could have imagined back when he was stuck sitting in that miserable Monday morning meeting. So I want to leave you today with one final thought to chew on. If you're sitting there right now feeling like you've lost years to the wrong career, the wrong mask, or just the wrong expectations, what if your wasted time is actually the exact foundation you absolutely need for the strongest years of your life? What if the breaking was literally just the prerequisite for the building? I really want you to think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this gives you a completely new perspective on the road ahead.